William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. Welcome to the College of Complexes, being held at Barbeck's Restaurant at 8949 Garland Road, Dallas, Texas. Gently embracing the east side of White Rock Lake. When I entered, I was greeted like coming home to Grandma's house, warm and friendly. When visiting the Barbeck's Restaurant, tell them you want your reservations for the next College of Complex class.
Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 214th meeting since we started in February 2009. Yes, answer your question. Anyway, we've been having speakers here since February of 2009. We put a speaker on for an hour. We give them an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, remind the interrupter that we only listen to one fool at a time. That's one of our rules. And we have questions and answers following that. And following that, we have remarks, rebuttals from the audience. Anyone who wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. Then our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment and close the meeting. We have another rule, and that is that the other rule is that no personal attacks. We don't attack the speaker, don't attack each other. So we keep this place pretty civil. Anyway, that's how that works. But before we introduce our speaker, are there any announcements? Now's the time for announcements, if anyone has one. Any announcements? Do you have an announcement? Any announcements? No announcements. I can't believe it. No announcements. All right. Well, our meeting next week is February 8th. That's giving to Caesar what belongs to God. It was created free. Why give up my right to choose? It's Reverend Raphael C. Joe, Bishop, therapist. He's Bishop Raphael. Yeah, it's what he says. Therapist and spiritual healer is going to discuss how civil religion invades the space of religious beliefs. It's on your itinerary in front of you there. And that's next week. Following week, we have Jim Davis going to talk about revisiting the letter that changed America and determining what to do. Following that, on February 22nd, we'll have police brutality in Dallas, politics and culture and the DAs in Dallas Police Department that breeds oppression. Colette Flagman, she's a founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality. We'll discuss this, and that'll be on February 22nd. I don't have it on the itinerary yet, but it's coming up. That'll be good. Anyway, our speakers tonight are Michael Jewell and Josh Gravens. Are president and chairman of the board, respectively, of Texas Cure, Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Errants. They're going to talk about a call for reform. Let's fix our prisons and our criminal justice and juvenile justice systems. They're going to discuss how our criminal justice system is broken and in dire need of reform. They will show how this applies to both adults and juveniles, and that those who experience the system are not the only ones who suffer from it. Taxpayers suffer as well. Mike and Josh will show how the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Institutional Division alone squanders a budget of more than $2 billion a year, where $1 billion in $100 bills weighs more than 2 tons, and 4 tons of $100 bills is a lot of money to waste on a system that is doing more harm than good. They will sound a clarion call for reform, showing what we need to do to fix our prisons and our criminal and juvenile justice systems. So without further ado, please give us a very warm welcome to Michael Jewell and Josh Gravens. You have the floor.
All right, thank you.
You got an hour.
You
want it.
Can I be heard?
Yeah.
All right. I'll give you a little bit of history of Texas Cure. It was founded in 1972 by Charles and Pauline Sullivan. Charlie was a priest and Pauline was a nun, and they dropped out of the church to get married. And they were activists, and they got arrested one day for protesting the Vietnamese War and thrown in jail. And when they saw what the conditions were like in jail, they were appalled, horrified, and decided to try to do something about it. They started a bus service to take wives and mothers to prison to see their loved ones who were incarcerated. And during the course of the trips to and from prison, they heard all these horrifying stories about how bad conditions were. And so they started going to visit legislators and lobbying for proactive laws to change the prisons and criminal justice in general. And a little bit about my personal history. As a juvenile, I went to reform school 5 times. And as an adult, I went to prison 3 times. The last time, I was incarcerated for murder. I spent 3 years on death row, and I wound up doing 40 consecutive years on a life sentence. And I came away with a pretty intimate knowledge of what it's like to do time in prison, how the administration is run and all that. And I know about all the conditions that need to be changed. I left a lot of friends in prison, and I know what it's like to be helpless and impotent to do anything about what you have to endure on a daily basis. And now, after meeting Charles Sullivan in about 1978, we corresponded for 30-something years, and I had a great deal of respect for Texas Cure and what it did for inmates, and I decided that I wanted to join forces and work with them. So that's what I'm doing now. And some of what Texas Cure does is we lobby for proactive litigation to bring about prison reform, positive changes in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. We testify before congressional hearings in support of bills that will further our objectives and against those we believe that will be harmful. We interact with prison administrators and advocate for prisoners' rights. We receive letters from inmates complaining about problems they are having, and we work with prison administrators in an effort to resolve them. We sponsor a free fan program for indigent inmates. Last year, we paid for 640 fans at a cost of more than $12,000. Since the fan program's inception in 2008, Texas Cure has provided more than 7,000 fans for indigent inmates. Texas Cure is an all-volunteer organization. We have no paid members or employees. One of my pet concerns is the parole system. It's very unfair, it's unequitable. The decisions that are made by the parole board members whether to release an inmate or not are very arbitrary and fickle. So that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. And I'm not a very well-trained public speaker, so I have to read my speech. Just bear with me. As mentioned earlier, I served 40 consecutive years of a life sentence, and unless I can do something via the courts, I'll remain on parole for the rest of my life. From the parole board's point of view, judging from the record presented to them, those who voted on whether to grant me a parole or to set me off based their decision on 3 factors: my past criminal history, the fact that I used a weapon during the commission of my crime, and the serious nature of the offense. The parole board used those 3 reasons to set me off time and time again, usually for 3 years at a time. Those 3 factors were immutable. There was absolutely nothing I could do to change them. It did not matter how many educational or vocational courses I took. It did not matter if I took substance abuse treatment, cognitive intervention, or anger management. Everything I did to better myself, to rehabilitate myself, meant nothing. As far as the parole board was concerned, the only thing that mattered was the immutable mistakes of my past. True enough, my crime was serious and should not have been treated lightly. But the faults of the parole board I complain of apply to all prisoners across the board: hot check writers, car thieves, and those caught with a gram of cocaine. A lot of people feel like that's the way it should be. If someone commits a serious crime, they should do serious time. I use the word feel because that belief is based on an emotional reaction. When we hear statements like, lock them up and throw away the key, we hear the voice of anger, prejudice, and bias. In this context, prejudice is a conclusion not based on reason or experience. Bias is an unfair opinion relating to a certain group of people, in this case, people who have committed crimes. The parole process in Texas is not fair. It lacks equality. When I committed my last crime, I had a fall partner. We were both charged with murder. We were both accused of firing a bullet into the body of the man we killed. A coroner testified that either bullet would have killed the victim. Initially, we were both sentenced to death. Our death sentences were commuted to life on the same day. We left death row and entered general population on the same day. Our criminal histories were very similar. We both had been to reform school as juveniles, and we both had served prior prison sentences. If the parole process were fair and equitable, you would think that my fall partner and I would have served the same amount of time before being granted a parole. Instead, my fall partner served only 16 years before making parole, while I served 40, a difference of more than 2 decades. If you research the parole archives, you would discover an overabundance of similar disparities. What's more, you would find many cases where burglars served more time than armed robbers, and cases where armed robbers served more time than murderers. You would conclude that the parole process in Texas is not fairly administered and lacks any semblance of equality. In point of fact, it is fickle and arbitrary. The question is, how can the parole process be made better? How do we end the disparities? How can we give all eligible prisoners an equal opportunity to make parole? These sound like daunting questions. It would appear that they present a challenging problem, but actually the solution is quite simple, and it is already in place. It's just not being properly applied. On September 1st, 2001, Section 508-152 was incorporated into the Texas Government Code. It was styled a proposed program of institutional progress. This law required Texas prison officials to make an in-depth evaluation of every prisoner entering the prison system, no later than 120 days after their arrival. The information to be acquired was, and I quote, 1, the court judgment, 2, any sentencing report, 3, the circumstances of the inmate's offense, 4, the inmate's previous social history and criminal record, 5, the inmate's physical and mental health of record, 6, a record of the inmate's conduct, employment history, and attitude in the institutional division, and 7, any written comments of information provided by local trial officials or victims of the offense. Part B, the department shall, 1, establish for the inmate a proposed program of measurable institutional progress, and 2, submit the proposed program to the board at the time of the board's consideration of the inmate's case for release. Part C, the board shall conduct an initial review of an eligible inmate not later than the 180 days after the date of the inmate's admission to the institutional division. Part D. Before the inmate is approved for release on parole, the inmate must agree to participate in the programs and activities described by the proposed program of measurable institutional progress. Part E. The institutional division shall, 1, work closely with the board to monitor the progress of the inmate in the institutional division, and 2, report the progress to the board before the inmate's release. End of quote. That was a state law. Now, think about it. Section 508-152 was designed to create a proposed program of institutional progress that could be monitored and measured over time. Inside prison, this program is known as the Individualized Treatment Program. Or the ITP. It was meant to provide the parole board with an effective assessment tool, a way to determine whether or not an inmate had bettered himself while in prison, thereby making the inmate a better parole risk. All prisoners entering prison must be thoroughly evaluated within 120 days of their arrival. For the sake of illustration, a few of the more important issues that must be determined include the inmate's educational level, his work history, and whether or not he had a problem with substance abuse. When these determinations are made, each inmate is issued a list of individualized ITP requirements that are tailored to meet his or her personal needs. For example, if an individual enters prison who had never held a job, more than a week or two, who had little education, and who also had a substance abuse problem, then his ITP requirements would include that he must complete a vocational class and learn a trade to improve his chances of gaining meaningful employment upon his release. Because this inmate is uneducated, another ITP requirement would be that he must successfully complete the GED program. Finally, because the inmate's prior substance abuse problems, she or he would have to complete a substance abuse program. Now, remember, this is the law. The ITP program is explained in the Inmate Orientation Handbook, a copy of which is issued to each new arrival. Inmates are cautioned that their ITP requirements must be met before they make parole. Failure to meet those requirements will not only jeopardize their chances at parole, it may also subject them to disciplinary action. But now, here's the rub. Even after an inmate does meet all of his ITP requirements, even after he has successfully demonstrated a measurable degree of institutional progress, there is no guarantee that he will be granted parole. Parole remains discretionary. I've often wondered what the voting members of the board base that discretion on. I know that for the first 30 years of my incarceration, that discretion was based on 3 factors, because they were listed on each of my 19 set-offs. My past criminal history, the serious nature of my offense, and the fact that I had used a weapon. Factors that were completely beyond my power to change. The only thing I could change was myself, my thoughts, my actions, and my attitude toward life. In closing, I want to say that I think Section 508-152 is a good law. It is a smart law. It is based on reason and logic and good old common sense. It stands to reason that the more you help prisoners to help themselves, the greater are the odds that when they leave prison, they will not return. Section 508-152 has only one major flaw. It fails to ensure the success of its own purpose, which is to prepare prisoners for release on parole. it still leaves a candidate's chances of making parole up to the discretion of parole board members, who too often base their decisions on stagnant, immutable factors of the past. There are 3 changes in law and policy that would greatly reduce the prison population, the prison budget, and thereby the cost to taxpayers. First, Section 508-152 should be amended to make parole mandatory for prisoners who successfully meet their ITP requirements and maintain a good disciplinary record up to the time they become parole eligible. Parole should not depend on the arbitrary whims and caprice of the parole board. Second, at present, a prisoner can be granted a parole, then lose it because of a protest from a victim of the prisoner's crime. Victims of crime are emotional reactionaries. They are expected to remain bitter and angry over whatever loss or hurt they suffered. But emotion should not be allowed to trump the educated decision of a board of trained professionals. Parole was designed to reward prisoners who demonstrate a positive change in their character and behavior. When the parole board decides that a prisoner has demonstrated such changes, their decision should be final and the prisoner should be released. Third, once granted a parole, a parolee must complete the remainder of his sentence under the supervision of the parole division. Many factors make this supervision extremely expensive. The parole division's projected budget for 2014 is right at $200 million. That sum could be greatly reduced with a few changes that would not present a threat to the public, but would greatly benefit an underpaid, understaffed, and overworked parole division. First, better use should be made of quarterly and annually reporting. Presently, the majority of parolees must report to their parole officers each month, which is why the caseload of parole officers is so overburdened or burdensome. The more parolees who switch to quarterly and annually reporting, the less stress and strain for parole officers. Second, parolees should not have to remain under parole supervision for the full remainder of their sentence. Once the prisoner has demonstrated a change in character and behavior and earns parole, and he demonstrates a permanence of that change by meeting all the requirements of his parole for a number of years, he should be granted a form of clemency and be freed from supervision entirely. For example, once a parolee has completed 3/4 of his sentence and has demonstrated an ongoing change in character and behavior, he should be granted clemency and released from supervision. If such a law were passed tomorrow, the state would instantly begin to save hundreds of millions of dollars per year. An overburdened parole division could take a great sigh of relief, and parolees could at last enjoy the freedom they have earned. Thank you.
We lose a little time in the trade-off there. So, my name is Josh Gravens, and I am glad to be here today. I guess a brief introduction about myself. I am chairman of the board of Texas Cure, and so he's already told you what Texas Cure is, so I'll just tell you who I am. I'm a Soros Justice Fellow for this year. My project deals with educating people about the harms of placing children on the sex offender registry. And so a lot of people are like, they put children on the registry, and yes, they do. I guess a brief history of why that is interesting to me is that at the age of 13, I myself was placed on the Texas Sex Offender Registry for a choice I made at 12. Long story short, if that's possible, I touched my sister when I was 12 years old. My mother attempted to get therapy and the therapist notified CPS. And the next day I was taken to juvenile detention, and then within 2 months I was sentenced to the Texas Youth Commission, which is no longer in existence. But through the course of events, one thing was really stand out about the entire system was that once things started rolling, there was nothing you could do to take things back. There was nothing you could do to change the course of what was going to happen. And at that time, if a kid was placed on the registry, they were placed on the registry for life. So in the state of Texas, there is no minimum age for registration. There is a minimum age for a prosecution, and that's 10 years of age. So there are several children that have been placed on the Texas Sex Offender Registry at the age of 10 years. I would say the median age is about 13. And the entire reasoning for the Sex Offender Registry was to protect children. And so when you place that stigma on children, children who go through the juvenile justice system, and if you know anything about or have heard anything about, the purpose of the juvenile justice system is to rehabilitate and give children a chance to correct their actions, or in some cases to get help in a home that's not necessarily the best environment. But the sex offender registration aspect of the juvenile justice system is just completely at odds with what we were trying to accomplish when we set up the idea of a separate system. So Michael mentioned his experience going through the system, and one thing I'd like to point out that Michael said to me once was that when he made his choices as a child, at no point did anyone ask, why did you make that choice, or really stepped up to mentor him, or in any way, shape, or form, to try to correct his course on life. And having gone through the juvenile justice system a little bit more recently, not much more, but just a little bit more, I can tell you it's about the same. And the only thing that's changed is that we don't call it reform school. That's about it. Kind of touching on his topic again, while meshing with mine, he mentioned, paroling for people who are prisoners, people that are being released, and I think a question that some people would ask is, why should we even care? I know I'm bouncing back to a different subject, but at least 95% of people that go to prison are probably going to come back home. And the question that I think Michael was getting at too is, what type of person do we want to come back? And so I can tell you that in my experience being in the state prison system was that while we had school, while we had things of that sort that were a little bit different than adult prison, that was about it. And in my dorm, particularly with kids from my background or with our cases, we spent a majority of our time in individual cells, while also receiving sex offender treatment, which is a very glorified version of sex education. We went to treatment every day when I was young. We would go through about 2 hours of therapy every day, which consisted of, I can't even say, but which consisted of getting into our thought patterns, getting into our thought process, identifying, a therapist identifying what we were actually thinking. So let's say a kid said, "No, I don't think that way." Your therapist would say, "That's not possible. You wouldn't be in prison if you didn't think that way." And so there was a very, you have this notion and idea of what therapy should be like, and it's usually a person that sits down with someone else and talks. Well, this was a whole lot of listening and a lot of inflecting by a therapist, where they told you, well, this is what you were thinking when you did that. And mind you, a majority of us, what we did was 40 years ago what you called doctor, 20 years ago what you called doctor. And very few typically less than 5, maybe even less than 1%, there was actually an aggressive act involved in sexual assault. But a majority of cases, they were childhood curiosity, which, you know, as a state, we don't really have sex education. Our public school system doesn't do anything to educate kids about, you know, the boundaries of sex, the appropriateness of sex as you grow up and as you age. There's different levels and different appropriate levels of how you should display it, and so I find it interesting that the kids that do display it in a way that doesn't necessarily mesh with the law, all of a sudden they have the most intensive sex education program that you could even imagine. And I can't even give an example, really. The system has changed somewhat. So kids nowadays don't automatically get publicly registered. There is a discretionary element that judges have that they have started to take great use of. They gained that ability in 2001, and it really, I think, set in with judges around 2005. And so a majority of children are placed on a non-public registration where you wouldn't find out about them, but law enforcement does. Well, the interesting thing about that is I had the opportunity to talk to a person from law enforcement. I asked him, you know, what's the youngest person you've ever seen registered? And I think he said 11 or 12. And he said, but you know, those juveniles that come in, they're the very worst offenders that we've ever had. And I said, well, what did he do? And he said, well, that little pervert touched his sister. I mean, he said, you know, that he comes in year after year and he thinks that's cute. But I'm further talking to the officer and just in other subsequent interactions. There was definitely a prejudice there. So when you have kids that are on non-public registration, and you have them on until they're 31, 32 sometimes, they're still interacting with law enforcement. And in some cities, they have what they call residency restrictions. And so these residency restrictions place, typically, depending on where you're at, if you're in McKinney, I think it's 2,500 feet around a park, school, shopping mall, theater, playground, anything you could possibly imagine. If this restaurant had a carousel in the front or a playground, then 2,500 feet around here. And so for people that were children when their offense occurred, when they're looking, like in my case, I have a wife and I have a few kids too, the effects of what I did at the age of 12 never really set in until about age 22. And that was when all of a sudden jobs were hard to get, and housing was hard to provide, and apartments were evicting us. And then you try to stand before a judge and say, you know, I told them, and they say, well, he's a sex offender, and the judge never looks up, the judge never says anything, doesn't even bother to pass judgment there, but has his secretary call later and say, well, we didn't side with you. They really created a system where I thought, my goodness, at what point does a kid get to move on from what they did? And so I called the judge's office that originally sentenced me, and I was talking to his clerk, and I said, I have a problem. I said, I need to talk to my judge. I've got this issue where I was sentenced as a 13-year-old, and this thing is still following me around. And she said, sir, that's not possible. Your juvenile record doesn't follow you. It's sealed at the age of 18. And I said, well, I'm registered. And so it's been a constant problem. And what was interesting is, like, at the beginning of the conversation, she was like real defensive and like, you know, you don't possibly know what you're talking about. And at the end of the conversation, she was like, well, why don't you write a letter to him, tell him what's going on, and he'll see what he can do. So I say that to say that I wrote back to him and just asking for access for my files. And he wrote back and said, well, even though you didn't ask for it, I'm taking your letter as a motion to remove you from the public registry. So I no longer have to deal with registration and stuff like that. But during the course of this, I began to ask myself, well, I'm registering, and there's lots of kids that are registering. What is the registry doing for us? Is there really a public safety element in sex offender registration? And as I began to research the topic, what was interesting is I got into advocating, or was getting into advocating on human trafficking, and I thought it'd be really powerful to have a registered sex offender advocating for human trafficking and reform, because there's a lot of issues in that. But as I began to research laws around sex offending, especially in Texas, across the country, I realized that there were a whole lot of people that were children or were young adults, 19, 20, who had girlfriends who were 16, 17, who urinated in public, a whole bunch of them. In fact, there was a case in North Carolina where a guy who went skinny dipping in the 70s said, I shouldn't have to register, and the Supreme Court of North Carolina said, well, sir, yes, you do, and you have to register for life. And so what public safety element, he's older now and he's not very interested in skinny dipping anymore. But I begin to question what's the recidivism rate? What's the rationale and the interest behind this? What's going on? And I found out for adult sex offenders, the recidivism rate is 8%, which sounds high, but as I continued to dig on, 8% included failure to register, 8% included property crimes, 8% included, so when you got down to the numbers, it's about 4%, which is 2% higher than the recidivism rate of murders, but about 48% lower than the general population. So you have the most vile people, I suppose, the people that you look at the most vile, the people on the registry, are the people least likely to reoffend. And I thought, well, surely not. The state wouldn't create a list of people that are least likely to reoffend. That doesn't make sense. Why would they put a whole bunch of people through families, especially in my case? I went back home where my sister lived, so all of a sudden she had the stigma of having a brother who was a sex offender. And what did that do for her? So as I went along, I decided that I was going to start educating the public about the sex offender registry. And the truth of the matter is that it gives a whole lot of looking like you're doing something about child sexual abuse, but in truth, it actually creates a system where you have a safety blanket, or it feels like a safety blanket, but it's not necessarily something that's doing anything for you. 95% of sexual offenses originate with someone the child knows well or is related to. So you only have about 5% of stranger danger cases. So what I hope to accomplish here is to create a dialogue, especially in the questions, because I can imagine there will be some pretty good ones, about our perceptions about people who go to prison for murder and our perceptions about people who go to prison for sexual offenses. Is there more to the story than what's behind the headlines, what's behind the perception of registration? And I think that you find that the media has definitely hyped, and certain cases in particular have definitely created an environment where we fear people on registries. And the reforms that I would like to see, especially in the state of Texas since we're here, is I would like to see no child being placed on registration of any form, because it's not necessary. Kids from my age group, which is 10 to 12, recidivism rate is between 0 and 2%. And what's needed in our state, particularly for everyone, is sex education. Good, viable sex education. Not this idea that kids won't have sex if we don't talk about it in school, because they are, and they're making very big choices, and they have no foundation to base those choices on, especially in our culture here, a very religious culture, nothing against religion, but in my family you didn't talk about sex. and that created a real problem. I was homeschooled as well, so that created a whole other aspect of the problem, as you could imagine. And so the first immediate reaction to a display of sexual behavior was, there's something wrong, and we need to get counseling. Never once was it, well, let's have a conversation about what's going on here. Let's direct or rechannel. No, it was, oh my gosh, this is not happening. What is this? There was an automatic fear, and then as I moved through the system, there was a fear, even today, 13 years later, that the kids are going to turn into adult predators. So I got the opportunity to attend, so I'd been out of the system for quite a while, and working on gearing up for my project. I wanted to see how far we've progressed and evolved and what's changed. And when I went to a conference put on by the state, particularly, in fact, it was called the Juvenile Sex Offender Management Conference, the theme of the show was no more victims. And their way of getting to that goal of no more victims was not rehabilitation, was not treatment, was not evaluating what was truly wrong, but their way to get to no more victims was to manage children. And these management tools include safety plans. And a safety plan, the example that was given, was an 11-year-old that wanted to go to the swimming pool. Well, before he could go to the swimming pool, his treatment provider had to certify that he had not had any deviant sexual thoughts for the past couple of months. He had to come up with a safety plan that would help him deal with near nudity at the swimming pool. He had to stay away from younger children at the swimming pool. He had to really make the case for where any other child who might have done something even worse could just go to the swimming pool and have no problems or issues. And so that really gets down to an issue about, what does that say to that 11-year-old? That says to that 11-year-old, I can't go to a swimming pool because I'm a danger. I am a pervert, I'm a pedophile, and I'm a monster. And those are the same thoughts that I had when I was younger. I couldn't understand why the therapist was saying one thing, but I inside was thinking, well, that can't possibly be true. You're not in my head. You don't know my thoughts. But sadly, I found that very much the same system as was going on when I was younger. At least they do recognize now that empathy is, when I was growing up through the system, empathy was the big thing that you had to learn about. But recent research has said that kids generally don't even really start developing the part of their brain where empathy is felt until about age 18, and really even up to age 25. That's why kids make rational decisions, because they can't place themselves in the other person's shoes. And so that draws a line. That's why do we have a juvenile system? And the reason we do is because that kids make mistakes, and kids process thoughts differently than adults do. But when you get into the idea of sexual offenses, there are some kids that have done some dreadful things. And as a society, we want to deal with those, obviously, and we want to make sure that the kid comes back fully rehabilitated. But the current system doesn't allow for that. The current system says, this is who you are, and you have to constantly fight your nature to not be that person anymore. And it never recognizes where the kid is at all. Michael mentioned individual treatment plans. Well, in juvenile, they're called individual case plans. And as nice as that sounds, all of the therapy sessions that we went to were group therapy. So while we were supposed to be individuals, we were a group all huddled in together, treated the same way, trying to work through issues as a group, which is not very effective. You definitely wouldn't take all of your friends to a personal therapy session at all, because why? It doesn't work. You need individual attention. And for most kids, it's not therapy that they needed as much as, again, sex education, boundaries, and just general education or mentorship. But that's not what happens. The juvenile system also has a parole system. I guess one thing I should say is there are some things that are different about the juvenile system. When I was a kid, there were about 30 facilities where they kept children. There's less on the state level, but they've kind of done a little reworking, where now most children are held at the county level for long term. And then if they fail a probation or parole or what have you, then they go into the state system. The state system has about 2,000. I guess when I was younger, the facility that I was at held about 2,000. So they've restructured it and put it on the local level, and they've kind of changed how the money is handled. And the interesting thing that brought on the change was that around 2007, it came out that guards were having sex with children. And in fact, that was the most interesting thing. Obviously, we were placed, I and other kids like me were placed in what they called the sex offender dorm. And it was very interesting when we had guards who were trying to elicit sex from children in the sex offender dorm. Some boys were really excited about that fact, and I wasn't necessarily. I realized, hey, I'm in jail for something not even as bad as you're doing, and you're here to take care of us. And so that created a real interesting situation. So finally, after some sexual incidences came out, and then it was realized that it was a system-wide issue, not necessarily just one facility. And then you tack on that one facility had a riot, which just kind of added to the issue. They finally disbanded the Texas Youth Commission, localized, and then switched to what they have now, which is the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. And there's rumors, even still, that they might try to merge the juvenile department with the adult corrections department, which will create some really interesting implications, because you can't house children with adults. In fact, there's strict standards in PREA that says, PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, says that you cannot house children with adults. So that's going to create a really interesting situation if they do decide to merge. Not to mention that adult probation officers and adult parole officers are, to some extent, even worse than juvenile probation or parole officers. Which brings me back to the point back at the conference. It was interesting to hear audience members speak about their own experiences with juveniles. And as I was sitting there minding my own business, not telling anybody who I was or why I was there, I heard two probation officers talking. And one was a little older guy, and one was a younger woman who'd just gotten into probation. And she was telling him, you know, I just can't read their individual case plan. I can't read their case files. And he, having said that he'd been in the business for a while, said, oh, you don't have to read their case files. They're sex offenders. You already know what they did. And so that there tells you exactly what a kid with a sexual offense goes through when they go into probation. They sit before a person who can send them to prison, who thinks that they're monsters. And what's interesting is the treatment scheme actually includes probation officers for children. They're an integral part of therapy. In fact, in some counties in Texas, they actually attend the therapy sessions, which can be very dangerous if you've ever met a probation officer. Hopefully none of you are. I might have offended you very deeply. But the treatment for sex offenders, especially children, includes polygraphs. If you know anything about polygraphs, the Supreme Court has said that they are not admissible because they're junk science. But what's interesting is that once you're in the system, polygraphs actually are the one thing that can place you in prison. They're used in treatment as an interrogation method. What's interesting is when a kid comes into the system, the very first thing they have to do for their treatment is to come up with their sex history, which is the entire history of your sexual life from age 0 to most of the kids that I've talked to were about 12. So it's a real interesting thing because most kids don't want to talk about it. So the very first thing you do is your sex history polygraph, which is where they quiz you on the history that you gave. And so what's really interesting about the polygraph, especially when given to children, is that it's very ineffective. And the whole reasoning behind the polygraph is actually not even the test itself, but it's to just point out variances, if you know or are familiar, if you've seen any shows that have the polygraph, you're familiar with that process. What happens is it reads your nerves, it reads your emotions, your responses. And children have all kinds of responses, usually can't sit still. Their mind wanders, and there's all sorts of issues that go on. So as they go through the questions, their responses are noted, and usually the polygrapher will take the equipment off, and then they'll sit them down, and they think they're done, and they'll ask them, you had a little bit of variance here when you talked about, when you had a kiss when you were 5 or something along those lines. Are you lying about that? And the kid will say, well, you know what, I did kiss Susie when I was 7. And all of a sudden, you have a failed polygraph because you lied on your sex history and you lied in your polygraph. And amazingly, judges will actually send kids to prison for that very issue. A polygraph that doesn't mesh with a sex history, and so on and so forth. And so the reforms that I would propose for children particularly, as I've mentioned, no registration. The treatment scheme has absolutely got to change. That's just kind of a brief look into how it's set up. I would take the element of the treatment provider out. It's become a cash cow business because treatment providers have no empty seats usually. They have a max of what they can do. In Dallas County, for example, we've got, I think, 20 juvenile sex offender treatment providers just in Dallas. And the average kid, they're paid about $200 a month per child. Some of them usually have up to 30. And if they fell one out, they get one right away. So they're also the folks that set the standards. They're the members of the Texas Council on Sex Offender Treatment that sets the standards. And so as a self-interested business owner that owns a therapy place that caters to sex offenders, are you interested in having less children come through your program? Not at all. Are you interested in lowering the cost of treatment? Not at all, because you have a private business entity that has joined forces with a state entity. And in fact, the treatment providers are, the interesting thing about how they view the client is not the child. The community is the client. And it is the treatment provider's duty to make sure that the community is safe. Now, where did you hear treatment in that statement? Not one single bit. The focus and the reason behind the system as they are is that they're essentially a quasi-probation officer that's paid about 2 to 3 times more than your average probation officer. And you would think that being clinicians and professionals, they would have a different mindset than your average person would. But the fact of the matter is, as I talked to one treatment provider again at the conference last year, she said, well, if you can survive this horrible conference, maybe, I'd mentioned that I was interested in getting in the field. She said, maybe, just maybe you can stay in the field, but she said, even I don't have the stomach to sit through this conference occasionally because it's just so gross. These children are horrible. And so she is a therapist that wouldn't have made it as a therapist, so she's a sex offender treatment provider. The sex offender therapy, you have to be licensed as a sex offender therapist. You cannot be just a general LPC or any other sociologist or you must have this certification. And so it's become a specialized field. And so that's created a real interesting dynamic where you have the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, that says, no, it should not be a specialized field. We're going about this treatment the wrong way. And then you have the American Psychological Association, especially not necessarily the national, but the Texas chapter has a very different approach. They think, obviously, most of their members are also, a good bit of them are also sex offender treatment providers. And so they have a very different look on the professionalism of telling children they're monsters. The reason I bring this to the table is I deal with a lot of children now who are going through the system very similar to what I went through. And what I get the privilege of meeting them before they go through the treatment scheme, and then I get to deal with kids afterwards. And what you have left is a shell of a person who, as soon as you start to talk to them, will spit off more than you could ever imagine about psychology and thinking errors and etc. And they can answer all the questions from a very clinical standpoint. And they become very cynical. I mean, not cynical, not even a good cynical, but they're very just being in the group treatment session. The one who passes treatment is the one who can be the most vicious to the other folks that are participating in their groups. So you have a kid who's lots of depression. There's some studies, it's not definite, but the suicide rate for kids who go through sex offender treatment is drastically high. I know there's some estimates that is between 20 and 50% of children who are placed into the system for sexual offenses. And so what is that all for? Is that for public safety? No, it's because politicians have said, this is how we want to look like we're addressing child sexual assault. This is how we're dealing with domestic issues. We're creating a list of people that you should avoid, people that you should hate. But we're really not doing anything about changing sexual abuse. In fact, the definition is so broad and includes so many folks that even if you were to include people on the registry, or if you were just to look at people on the registry that really legitimately should probably be monitored, there's only about 2,000 to 5,000. And currently in the state we have about 80,000 registrants. Dallas County has 5,600, for example. And in fact, if you ever go through the registry, you'll see that there's several kids. The system changed for those, unlike me, who didn't get to go back to court. They were given a post-10, which means for 10 years after release, they're required to register. So if that had been applicable to me, I would have ended registration around age 31. So I would have registered for about 18 years. But if you go through the registry, you'll find several kids who have been on there for longer than they should have been because they're not being taken off as soon as their time has ceased. And so currently that's one of the projects that I'm working on, is trying to get all of those kids who shouldn't be listed anymore, who are still going in, mind you, to register. Even though their duty is expired, the law enforcement is not telling them. In fact, law enforcement is supposed to evaluate when their expiration date comes up. And so I've been in conversations back and forth with the attorney with the Department of Public Safety that is charged with maintaining the sex offender registry in trying to get these kids off, and it's very difficult to do. You would think it would just be a button, but actually it is not that simple. And the law says that when their duty is expired, they're to be removed quickly. And that's just not happening. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is trying to get folks off who shouldn't be on there. And I don't know where we are at a time, but
You got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. So the registry, it's an interesting thing that you never hear about are the people who aren't registered that live with the person. I, as a rule, when I was registered, didn't participate in any of my children's schooling events. Actually, I wasn't allowed to. I have 4 children, 9, 6, 3, and 2. And up until removal from the registry last year, I had never been to any school event of any sort. And the question, what is that for? I keep asking that, but that's a valid question. What is the reason? If it is a legitimate public safety concern, if a kid makes that choice, at what point do they stop paying for a decision they made? In fact, I had the fortunate situation that my sister actually wrote a letter to the judge and said, I forgot about that a long time ago. It's not even an issue to me. I don't understand why the state can't get over it. She said, in fact, you have no idea the amount of stuff that has happened to me, or because my brother has been on the registry. He's been an active citizen, and she said, I'm 19 years of age now at the time, and she said, what's the point? And so that's one interesting aspect you never see or hear about, are all the families that are affected. So for one registrant, you might have 10 people. Parents, I know parents who have had to move because their kid was coming out of prison, and their house was no longer, they couldn't live there because 2 weeks ago the city passed an ordinance that said your kid can't live 2,500 feet of the school he's going to attend. So, that's kind of one of the interesting aspects, is that he can't live there, but he can go to school there. So I think that's probably enough to say on that topic. I'm interested to see questions. That's usually the format that I like to talk in, is a very interactive speech where people stop me and ask questions. So I know that me and Michael are probably looking forward to that, if that's okay to move into questions.
You can stay right there.
All right.
You and Mike both. Anyway, where's the
Right here, I think.
Right in front of the podium, sitting next to you.
Hi, thanks for speaking.
Yeah.
Appreciate you coming out. The question I have is, you talked a lot about things that you think should change, but what things is your organization doing to make changes real? Are you lobbying? I mean, I imagine you're lobbying legislators. What is their reaction to your response, and have you made any headway?
Well, on my issue, so I guess it should be clear, our organization is a multifaceted, we don't care what you did, we're going to represent you, and we think there's systemic changes that should affect everybody. But and I've joined CURE recently, and I know we'll probably be kicking off some stuff. But as far as legislators go, frankly, they don't know a thing about registration. I talked to one guy, Representative Hardy out of Nacogdoches. He had authored a bill that was called, the name escapes me, but essentially it barred registrants from any occupation that puts you in the house, unsupervised, operation of carnival vehicles, taxi, bus, all kinds of professions. And I asked him, why did you not make an exception for children who were placed on registration? And he said, well, I did. I said, no, you didn't. It said conviction or adjudication. Adjudication is the equivalent of placing children, of a conviction for a child. And he said, well, you're coming about this a completely different way than I was viewing. And I said, I am, because you didn't make an exception for children at all. And he said that he was interested in reforming the registry. However, I don't see that happening. There are some legislators that are working on it. I know for the next session, which is in 2015, the ask is going to be that no children will be placed on the registry. There will probably be concessionary. I know the federal level says that you, under age 14, no registration. Over age 14, for some cases, life registration. And that was the Adam Walsh Act, signed into law by George W. Bush in 2006. What was interesting is children were thrown into registration. They were never originally intended to, but because of the testimony of one person in a closed session, they decided to extend the age down from 18 to 14. So obviously in my own project, I work on educating folks and talking to folks about registration, because most people have never realized that there's actually kids on registration, particularly at least 6,000 to 7,000 in the state of Texas.
Well, I have a question. Are there photos on this registration? I know in Chicago, at the Cook County, I was doing real estate, and I remember that my client said he was moving, and he moved from across the school, from where a school was in Evanston, and then he was looking for this condo, which I showed him, and then I just happened to be looking on the Cook County, I forgot what it was called, it was a website, and there was his photo, and he was registered, and it said that he had accepted pornographic children's literature or whatever, put him on the register, and he had to move.
There are pictures. In fact, I should have brought some examples, but there's some wonderful pictures of kids that have been registering since age 10 or so. And some departments have removed the younger photos, but a lot you can find. And you see a man now, and then you scroll down all the way to where he was 10 years old, and he's been registering, and people have been photographing him time and again, fingerprinting, and yes, there are pictures. Well, this is actually the state registry, but yes, so those pictures get picked up by private websites, and private websites will post those pictures again. So let's say a kid does come off registration, for example, myself. If you Google me, you'll still find my pictures hosted by third-party websites, some that are not even based in this country because of our First Amendment rights and the press' continued push to keep arrest records public. It's very difficult to get those pictures off at all. And in fact, due to some lobbying, the state passed a bill last session where you're able to sue the entities in order to try to remove your pictures, but they're in other countries. So are they going to listen to a Texas court? Probably not.
So my question pertains to those people who, I don't know, I think most of us started dating when we started high school. Maybe a few started earlier or later than that, but I started high school when I was 13. And
Wow.
I invited a senior to go to prom. To Sadie Hawkins dance with me, and he was 17, and he did, and it was perfectly innocent or whatever. But let's say that I then got into a relationship with this person, and then he turns 18. He's immediately a sex offender, whether right.
Yes.
So by the definition of the law, I guess what I'm wondering is if you've done any research that shows how many sex offenders were already involved in a relationship with someone who was younger and had been dating
Or
them.
went on to marry their victim, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Victim,
Yes.
supposedly. So many. This just absolutely baffles me that this could happen to high school kids becoming sex offenders because they've been dating somebody all this time, and then their age changes.
Their age changes, or someone gets mad in the relationship.
Right. Or, the parents don't like it, or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you have any statistics about how...
It's hard to determine.
That would
I'm not sure. There are quite a few. That's probably a project that needs to be done. I haven't come across anything like that. I am part of an organization called Texas Voices that deals with trying to reform sex offender laws, and a great majority of members were actually what they call Romeo and Juliet cases, where there was a 19 and 15, 16, sometimes even up to 17, depending on where they're from, where the age had changed. Or if you dated a senior that was even 17, there is a defense if you go to court, an affirmative defense, but there's not there's not an exception. So if the case is picked up by the police, so a lot of times what happens is CPS picks up a case and says there's no problem, but somehow or another it gets into the police departments, and the police will drag a kid out of school in handcuffs and shackles based on a sexual offense, no matter how old the kid is. There's not a definite number, but I do know quite a few people who their victim was and is now their spouse. And with that being said, he's still a lifetime registrant. There's no mechanism whatsoever currently to even get him off. And he happened to be 18 and she's 16. So,
Margaret.
I just had a question that kind of connects with Susie's, and it's my understanding now that the law is such that if you became aware even of the fact that this 18-year-old boy was having sex with this 15-year-old girl, you yourself would be obligated to report it.
Right.
I mean, which is even more.
I'm just talking about dating.
Yes, but
dating where there is no sex,
well, then
but
if
somebody
there
else
wasn't-
may think that there was or something.
I would guess CPS, I mean, those types of cases
Yes.
probably would get dismissed. I mean, there's no proof to anything. It would be more likely that the excitement would be if there was a pregnancy involved. Then you would have some proof.
yes.
You know what was very, there's a lot of unsettling information that you told us about. The thing that really gets me is the unethical behavior of the therapists.
Yes.
They're under, certified by the state, and yet they are behaving in very unethical ways. I mean, how do they get their job? I mean, they're actually doing everything against their professional ethics.
That's why they created a specialization, so that they could, in essence, remove themselves out from under the professional standards and into a new field that they created themselves for money, which is what happens when you have private entities that get connected. What's interesting, again, back to the conference, I went to the ethics session, which was the very last session, and I was one of 20 out of 500 people that attended it. But that I know I'm good friends with a guy who was a sex offender treatment provider and eventually let his license expire because he could no longer stomach his profession. The state actually mandates that they practice what is called the containment model, and that containment model is a team approach to treating. And this is kid all the way up to 90 if you committed your offense. And that mandate is that there be polygraphs, that they have an active communication between the treatment provider and the probation officer. So what's really interesting, and I didn't get into, but I know parents who they sit down with their kid the night before and they make up deviant sexual thoughts to talk about in the class the next day, because the therapists are not interested if they don't have, they feel like they're not making progress if they're not admitting to a new victim or a new deviant thought each time they come in. So parents will literally sit down and say, well, this is what we're thinking about, this is what we did. And then when those kids get felled and go before a judge, which they will, all of that stuff that they told the therapist is all of a sudden in the prosecution's notes. So there is a very open dynamic where the Hippocratic Oath is absolutely soiled, as well as any ethical standard for a profession.
One other question. Have you heard about this new book that's newly published by a neuroscientist, and it's called Brainstorm, and it talks about what they're finding out, how the brain is working when you're a kid, a teenager from 12 to 25.
I think he was on Think the other day, right? NPR, yeah.
And I bought the book, and I haven't yet read it, but but that should have an effect in the near future. That how can you, if the brain is in a storm, how can you take to task this child and blame him for the rest of his life?
Well, that's where
I'm hoping that will make a change. Don't you hope?
You hope so. I mean, public policy, and he can talk about this too. The politicians are usually far behind on, I mean, if you look at neurological science, really didn't make an into law until 2005. Well, there's more, but 2005, we were putting kids to death. Up to that point, if you had committed a crime at age 15, I think actually 16 was, they had moved it up to about 16. So if you had committed murder at age 16, you could be tried well, not even as an adult, but you could be given the death penalty. And finally, in 2005, Roper v. Simmons said that children don't have the mental culpability to make the decisions, and we can't be putting them to death. And in the course between 1989 and 2005, Texas was the only state that actually put a kid underage to death. So that, I mean, that's the same mindset with policymakers. In fact, I have a person that I know that she had some a bill that she had taken to the legislature, and it was a strictly juvenile bill, and they were going to get an unnamed member of the legislature to author it or to propose it, and he said, "Does it have sex offenders in it?" And I said, well, it doesn't make an exception to who the child is. And he said, "I'm not going to touch it if it has anything to do with sex offenders." So it's a long uphill battle on that front.
Yes, hello. Edward Snowden has just revealed that we have, as George Orwell said, Big Brother is surveilling us. He also talked about the thought police. Do you think that his revelation has come true about the thought police? The thought police.
Well, there's this interesting mechanism for the thought police. It's called civil commitment. And it is basically that if a person, regardless of if they're a child or an adult, they have had more than one sexual offense. So let's say in the court, let's say they had, let's say it was a father, 2 daughters, or a brother with 2 sisters, or whatever have you. They're automatically flagged for a civil commitment interview. I know someone who's been in prison for about 20 years, and he just went through one, and he's passed. But in the interview, if they find the possibility that you may commit another sexual offense, there's a mechanism for them to take you to court in Montgomery County. Montgomery County alone, there's an actual judge there and a few members of the prosecution that will hear a hearing on whether or not you're likely to reoffend. And then that I know, I don't think anybody has won a case. Every single person has been not convicted, what would you call it? Committed, civilly committed. So we do have thought police, and I think, I mean, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think they're practicing on sex offenders. And I think, you know, if nothing is done, that it will probably spread into other areas. I know there's already ideas for registries for people that domestic abuse pets. I mean, so it's, if you don't do anything about it, you might be on some form of registry later on. Jaywalking.
Yeah, this really does smack of impure thoughts and the Inquisition, I think.
It is. If you've ever been through a polygraph, you probably know how the Inquisition felt.
It's interesting to think that sex offenses are the only crimes that apply to civil commitment. But we have to ask the question, when does it turn over to murderers, armed robbers, burglars, and on down the chain until there's not a crime you can commit and do your time for and ever be free? When you're civilly committed, it's indefinite until some therapist who's making money off of you decides that he doesn't want to make money off of you anymore and says you're cured.
And there have only been, in Texas, there have only been 2 people that have progressed, and they have been able to, as Anton said, walk down the street to a convenience store, buy candy, and come back. And they wear GPS monitors within the facility that they're in. And one interesting fact, within the United States, there's about 6,200 people that are civilly committed, but it costs over $1 billion to indefinitely detain every one of them each year. And there's not even really a science or reason behind it, except that some jury of their peers has deemed them, and it's interesting because they're civilly committed, so it's like a whole nother trial over what you've already done. They take it out of the criminal justice system and put it in a civil court, that way to avoid the constitutional double jeopardy issue.
My question may be more for Mr. Jewell. I have two relatives that have been in long-term in the Texas prison system, and I've known several people who have been involved. I've never heard of CURE before. What type of activities do you have in the Dallas area for people? There used to be, I think it was Open Incorporated, that was in Dallas for families, but I've never heard of.
I don't know much about Open, but there's an organization that we network with called TIFA, Texas Inmate Family Association. And
in Dallas?
There's one in Dallas. They meet monthly. When Joan, my wife, and I joined Texas CURE, it had just about fallen by the wayside. It disintegrated over a long number of years, and we're just now beginning to revive it, you know. And as far as the people you have in prison, the main thing that we do is interact with prison officials in order to help resolve problems that inmates are having. You know, for example, just last month, an inmate wrote to us and said that he had received a bogus disciplinary case. And he had already filed his Step 1 and Step 2 grievance to appeal it. And they give boilerplate responses to such grievances. They're pat answers. You can look at 1,000 grievances, and 950 of them are going to be almost verbatimly answered. But he told me that he had two officers who were willing to testify that he could not have been where he was supposed to have been at the time the offense was committed. So I wrote a letter to Brian Collier, who's the deputy director of TDCJ, and explained the issues. And within 2 weeks, he responded that he had investigated the case and reversed and expunged it from the inmate's record.
One other question. Does your organization work with NAMI? Because there's been a lot of National Alliance for Mental Illness, there's been a lot of action in that community about the state of how many people are in prison, that if they had had treatment in their younger years, in Texas particularly, they wouldn't be there now.
True. No, I'm not really familiar with that organization, but at a TIFA meeting we attended a couple of weeks ago, I gave a talk similar to the one I gave tonight, and during the course of my problems with the criminal justice system, from the age of 12 when I first went to reform school, I was literally confined for 3/4 of my life. And during that period of time, no professional sat down with me and asked me, did I realize that what I was doing was wrong? No one tried to encourage me to better myself. What education I got despite the system, not because of it.
Anyone else?
Since I have some personal difference in this, when I was becoming a cub reporter, and I worked for 2 of the magazines down here, and also doing a little AA over one, what do they call that? I can't remember, the Way Something House.
Way back.
That's it. And one fellow was sent back to jail for not paying his dues. Well, somehow I ended up collecting his property, and one day I just started going through all his property, kind of getting rid of the good stuff, trash stuff, and what have you. And I found his receipts. He had made every payment, and we took it to. It turned out that the parole officer was minding the money.
Right.
The bottom line of this is the parole officer never went to jail, was never arrested, was just transferred to some outlying parole office, and the person that went to jail for not paying his dues is still in jail. Now, this has happened about 5 years ago.
But they weren't able to get really.
No, he's still in jail. These guys are not telling you real nightmares. I know nightmares.
We've been working with, are you going to talk about Shirley?
I was going to confirm that my good friend has a son inside, and he was put in because of non-payment, and she has all of her records. This is not a poor family, and proof that all of his payments were made, but he's still in prison. They brought up another account too, which was failure to please the therapist, and the therapist asked him not to come back. And it's happening all the time. The crookedness among the therapists is absolutely shocking.
We've had an attorney working on that case for 8 months now, and he's being stonewalled at every turn. The problem is when you get entangled in a situation like that, because of the bureaucratic red tape and the legal hurdles, it's almost impossible to have someone extricated.
It's easy to send someone to jail, but it's very difficult to reverse the process, even when you find out that what happened didn't happen. There's lots of people who can't pay their therapist's bill, and so, and this is kids included, and the requirement usually in the courts that you not be failed out of a program. Well, non-payment can fail you out of a program, and when you fail, you've violated your conditions of probation or parole, and all of a sudden poverty has sent you back to prison.
Debtor's prison.
Debtor's prison. That is correct.
I got in late, so I don't know if this was discussed, but I thought I would bring it up. Political prosecutions, where the people are put in, like, for instance, 30 years for having maybe 2 joints in their car or something like that. And just always getting a no bill from the parole board every time. I mean, just
Right.
Staying in.
Prison are full of cases like that.
How big a role is the private sector corporations playing in all of this? Because they're running the prisons. They're privatizing a lot of the prisons, and I'm just wondering if someone's making a buck on these poor souls.
Well, the Corrections Corporation of America is one of the biggest private prison corporations in Texas. They're all over the United States, but they have more private facilities here than any other private contractor. And it's interesting that when they make a contract with the state has to agree that at all times they'll keep the facility to 95% capacity. So how do they do that? How do they accomplish that? Well, whenever a private prison makes a contract with the state has to guarantee that they will keep that facility 95% full at all times.
But the worst part is that if it falls below 95%, we taxpayers pay for that empty bed.
Yeah.
Because the contract has guaranteed that it will be 95% full.
My last stint in juvenile prison was in a private prison, and for children with sexual offenses, the state paid $225 a day versus general population they paid $75 a day. So the facility therefore had a policy never to allow any kids with sexual offenses to release, because why would you lose $225 a day and possibly get replaced with a $75 a day? There's a real incentive. So most of us stayed over by about 1 to 2 years. just for that reason, money. And then each, as I put it out, each individual treatment provider is typically their own business. They employ themselves. And so it's a really self-interested cycle where they are appointed by the governor to the Council on Sex Offender Treatment, and thereby get to set the rules for who can even, interestingly, like the state passed a mechanism for adult sex offenders to come off in 2007, I think, and it was by the push, well, it was just, there had to be a method for them to come off, and only 6 have come off since 2007 using that method. And the interesting thing about it that was put in there was that they had to go through an analysis, a really detailed, lengthy $1,000 analysis that they wouldn't ever commit another crime again, or another sex offense rather. And that obviously was put in there, and definitely encouraged treatment providers to get that specific certification so they get to do that. But now they're, since no one has come up because the criteria for getting off is so strict, the treatment providers have said, hey, we paid, I think for the certification they paid a significant amount of money. They said, hey, we paid this money and we can't get anybody to come up because you're not letting anybody off the registry. And so it may be interesting that this works into a private business crisis that actually gets the state to do something about it.
Several years ago, I had read that as far as the death penalty, with all the deaths we have in Texas, that at that time it cost $38,000 a year for each person incarcerated. Since then it's gone up some, but for each person on death row it costs millions of dollars because of the legal fee. So money is being made off of the death penalty.
From the time a death penalty defendant is indicted until the time that he's actually put to death, he's going to cost Texas about at least $1.5 million.
Which, in terms of a guard's salary, how many guards is that about?
Well, guards make $36,000, $37,000 a year.
So a death row inmate creates more jobs than a whole lot of folks do. I guess if you look at an economic incentive. That's one interesting thing about prisons. It costs the adult side $3 billion a year, and then for kids about $500 million a year. And ultimately, it's the wonderful political slush fund, because you can push favors off to your contractors. If you go through, you'll see all kinds of interesting, a lot of the, I know Bob Barker Corporation, who is like the leading supplier, which is not the same Bob Barker from The Price is Right, but they started business in the 1970s, and shortly after they got into business, prison and the prison industry just kind of took off. But if you go back and look at their political contributions, they're strictly Republican, and that's not to say one party or the other locks more people up. I know more Republican bills have affected my life adversely than any Democratic bills, but you see that a lot, that it's this wonderful area that you can slush fund in, and no matter how much you increase it, the public's going to support it, because you've told them that Michael and I are the people you don't want to be around. And so, overwhelmingly, nobody does anything about it.
Several years back, maybe a decade or two, a phrase was coined called the prison industrial complex. And if you start Googling that and go to the different branches that shoot off from it, you'll be astounded at the number of businesses that feed off of the prison system. You have transportation systems. You have the monitors that everybody's wearing now when you get out. When I got out, I had to wear one for 18 months. And I did a little research on the company that manufactures the monitors, and they have 600 executives that make over $100,000 a year.
600?
600.
So my question gets back to education. That thing that was cut, $5.4 billion by the 2010 Texas legislature, and that you mentioned education, sex education being one thing that could be done to help, but one thing that struck me listening to Rick Halperin speak about the death penalty was that the number of prison beds is needed within a certain number of time is based upon the number of children who drop out of the 5th grade or who don't pass the 5th grade. And my question for you is, what resistance or what reception have you received from speaking with or lobbying with legislators about education in particular to help stop this, okay, how many 10-year-olds are misbehaving or, headed for prison? Hey, what types of activities has your organization taken? What can we do from an education perspective to invest that money up front and have productive society members as opposed to a pipeline to prison?
Well, Joan,
it's a loaded question.
Joan and I have been to a couple of ACLU meetings where that was the subject of discussion. And we haven't personally gotten involved in it, but we've networked with the ACLU and we support them. We're members, as a matter of fact. But the pipeline from school to prison is a very terrible thing. I dropped out of school in the 4th grade.
Yeah. Of course, from my point of view, I was a teacher in DISD. Our educational system in Texas is very, very poor, the public school system. It's based on rote learning to pass tests. It doesn't have any of the more thoughtful programs where kids have to figure things out and write essays and really use their brains and their minds and develop their skills. Now, we have some very good private schools in Texas, but in terms of the public schools, it seems to me we're way far behind, and it's just going to be this way because the guys that are, and women too, I'm sure we don't hear much from the women, but the men who are in prison are terribly uneducated. They can hardly write. They certainly have difficulty expressing themselves. The ones who write the best letters and seem to have the best education very often are sex offenders because they have a tendency to be, there must be more white middle-class sex offenders in prison than lower uneducated classes of people. Now I'm probably crazy about that, but all I know is that there's 60% indigency in the Texas prison, and those 60% are very poorly educated, and they've gone through maybe not even gotten to high school or have been pushed through high school. So there's something wrong with our school system.
Yeah, the tax, obviously the tax frame that we have for education, it seems to be keep property taxes low. The whole scheme is really messed up. The interest, and I come back to this too. I know Texas is one of the states that has an amendment for homeschooling. We fought for that right, and it's not necessarily there's not necessarily a whole lot of people that are homeschooled, but I know that I was, and I couldn't read or write until I was 11, and it really wasn't until I got to prison that I actually got an education, and that education was far below what I would have received in a normal setting. As far as prison goes, and the teachers that teach in prison are often the ones that couldn't make it in the mainstream, and so they come into the prisons and they teach, sleep, whatever. I really don't know what we can do to change the pipeline. The one thing I know that we don't need is more police in our schools, because in 2011 they wrote 500,000 citations, something along those lines, including to children as young as 6. And so I know that in particular, especially in Dallas, teachers have stopped taking care of disciplinary issues, and they just call the cop into the classroom to handle the situation. And what does a cop do? The only mechanism they have to do, and that's to arrest, to remove. And I know that's a major part of the pipeline. You get kids that are going through screenings and then pat downs, and we really have militarized schools. So no, we don't need more guns in school.
Well, I think it may have something to do with the whole cycle of poverty in Texas, because all those men or women that are incarcerated have children. Mm-hmm. And those are the children who don't have anyone supporting them at home. Whereas a lot of people, I've been impressed lately with how many people that are incarcerated. I know other people who may have committed the same crime, but because they had money, they were able to get out of it. Yeah. And so it continues with the poverty.
And then you add to the fact that the Pell Grant, for instance, if you have a drug offense, you're no longer applicable for the Pell Grant. Well, who needs the Pell Grant the most? It's the people who are affected by, interestingly, food stamps. Sex offenders in the new Farm Bill have been banned from receiving food stamps as of the new food stamp reform has made it where sex offenders cannot get food stamps.
I have 2 questions, one for each of you. This is to Michael, and I'm interested in your perspective as a prisoner. I'm wondering if you've seen prison labor being contracted out to private companies. Has that something you've noticed throughout the time that you were confined, or is there being a push for that in recent years?
Well, if you go back in Texas prison history, they used to have what they call leasing contracts, and convicts were leased to cotton farmers and mines, Imperial Sugar Company and all that. But in recent years, you might remember the scandal with the Mustangs. On the Pallage unit, they have a metal fab factory, and they were making Mustangs for Shelby, what's its name, and they were selling these designer cars to very wealthy people out here in the world. And then one of the guys who were working on the cars slipped out a release to the press that about 35 to 65% of the car was Bondo. So they shut that down, you know. And then
What's Bondo?
It's a plastic.
What they used to repair broken out cars.
Right. Well, they had a lot of holes to fill, but and then after that, the same metal fab factory and one on, I think it was the wind unit, they were making these big heavy-duty trailers that you can haul heavy equipment around on, like caterpillars and stuff like that, bulldozers. And a company that made them in the free world was going bankrupt. So they sued TDCJ because they didn't have to pay for labor. But they were paying the inmates a pittance, you know, something like 50 cents an hour or something like that. And whenever it became a scandal in the press, then they shut that program down too. And now they have what they call Texas Correctional Industries, or something like that.
Yeah.
and they make all kind of furniture, leather goods, and stuff like that, and people can order it from them. There was a kind of a small scandal a couple years ago where a couple of senators and state representatives were investigated for buying this exotic furniture and stuff through the Texas Correctional Industries program. And those workers make a very small, piddly amount of money, a token payment.
It's just that some people that I've heard say, well, at least they should be able to work for something and get paid for their labor. But to me, it just smacks of Jim Crow all over again.
Yeah, well, it is. It's exactly that. And two good books on that subject is
Slavery by Another Name.
Slavery by Another Name, and The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexandra, and Texas Tough by Robert Perkinson. But
the other question is for Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was interested in the path that you took between the time that you were confined and the time you were off paper.
Yes.
Like, because it's more mysterious than just a criminal conviction.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Are you what you mean, like where I went?
The path through the system.
The path through the system. Yeah. So like CPS gets involved, jail the next day, Texas Youth Commission 2 months later, Texas Youth Commission till 1 month before.
You were 12 when you were first arrested.
I was 13 when I was first arrested, so it came out that I touched my sister a few months later. And then my mom, the very day, called a counselor. And then 17, I get out, I go straight back, I go to high school, and everything's good in high school till about the last 2 weeks before graduation, and then all of a sudden it gets out that I'm on the registry. And then the last 2 weeks, the one activity that I love the most, going to school, all of a sudden became the worst thing in the world. And I graduated in shame when I was 18. And then I went off to college on a full scholarship. And during this time, I was on parole, actually. And it came, one TV station picked up the fact that I was a registrant living on campus, and they ran a story with my picture and profile, and then all of a sudden death threats and all kinds of things. I stopped going to school and I drop out of college. So I come off of parole finally about age 21, because you can't get off early for that. And then just a couple of months later, I actually pick up an adult conviction for failure to register, which in that case, my parole officer had given me permission to travel for work that I did at the time. And then she said, everything's okay, you're good here. Well, I didn't know the rules that applied, that I had to register wherever I was. I thought as long as my home was where my home was, I was good. But anyways, I got a conviction for that. It's a third, actually in that case it was like a 4th degree. It's just above a misdemeanor, but they want to make sure that it's a felony. And so the registration in and of itself, so the interesting thing is, like, my records were sealed. So like you could find me on the registry, but you couldn't find what the hell I was on there for, because the charge wasn't there. So that created an interesting situation where they're like, well, we can't see your charge, but we do see you're on the registry. And then you're talking to employers, which interesting, like if you could actually get to the part to where you were talking to them about what happened, most of them were like, oh gosh, well, yeah, but getting to that point when on the registry was almost impossible. And if it hadn't been for a judge telling me that I could come off, it wouldn't happen. So that's why I'm working on trying to get people off, because a lot of guys don't even know they can come off. And so that's definitely what I'm trying to work on, is to tell them, because the law's changed and no one took the time to say, hey, you can change this. So.
Okay, this is a question about being in prison. Are there any programs in there for actually developing skill sets when you're working in prison, like gardening, growing, things like that, or metal shop or things?
Well, yeah, they have a variety of programs, and on their face, they appear to be very valuable. And a couple of them are, like, they have a pretty good welding program. You can take vocational welding. And I know a lot of people who have gotten out and in a short period of time received welding jobs. But other things, like, say, sheet metal, for example, or working in the textile mill, all of their equipment is so archaic, it's obsolete. So you learn how to perform a trade on a machine that no longer exists. You can't even buy parts for it. And you come out here in the world and there's no workplace for you.
Not to mention you have a conviction, which is a high hill to climb in that fact. And as far as kids go, at least when I went through, you would think there would be something, but there was no viable, there was education, and even that was subpar. So
I'd like to go back to the question about do they make money off of inmates? The Texas Department of Corrections manufactures probably 200 to 250 different commodities that it sells to state institutions. For example, the DPS, all the state universities like the University of Texas, every stick of furniture in the university is manufactured in TDC. In all your courtrooms, every bench, every flag pole, even the flags, the Texas flag and the United States flag, are manufactured in TDCJ. They make an impressive array of commodities, and they make a tremendous profit off of it. I've always been baffled by the fact that TDCJ receives any kind of budget at all, because they make hundreds of millions of dollars off of the stuff they produce. For example, I was a dental technician for a while in TDCJ, and our supervisor loved to brag about the fact that it costs 26 cents to make a set of dentures because it's all acrylic plastic. And we had contracts with all the state mental hospitals and like Gary Job Corps, and we sold their patients dentures for $32.50 a set. And I've always wondered where the profit from that went. You know, Mr. Mitchell was his name. He liked to brag that we made something like $1.6 million a year just off the dental lab.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk. So who wants to be first to say for or against or anything that they have said? Who wants to be first up here? There has to be a first. No, you're so good. There's no response? Nothing?
No, there's no. You can't argue.
Well, you could be for. Here's somebody who's going to. It has to be one. It has to be at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go ahead.
Well, I missed the talk, so I mean I'm the perfect person to give the rebuttal because I don't know what I'm rebutting. But I think it's really obvious that we have a prison industrial complex, and that is what we're dealing with. And the interesting thing about the structure of it is, of course, well, where do they make their money off of every inmate, every bed for the inmate, every cell, everything like that? It's really out of the taxpayer. We have been asleep, public. We have allowed this metastasizing cancer to grow in our society. And I grew up in a liberal family. My father was one of the primary people in Project Head Start, working with the top people. He at one point was a 4-state regional director of Head Start. And the amazing thing of it is I was kind of out of things for about 14 years, and I came back, and I mean, I'm like, well, what the heck happened with all this help? And I got a chance to talk to him one time, and he said, well, our mission was to give people a hand up. not a handout. And I think this is part of the sickness in this country, is all these different social programs, LBJ's Great Society and all of this. Who is assessing it at every stage and saying, are we getting the result? Are we producing the result that our planning was for? Or are we getting 180 degrees the opposite? And I look now, I mean, my dad really, he was in these different programs. Then he was on an EOC, what is that, Economic Opportunity? Equal Opportunity, yeah. And he was in there, and he was saying there's so much immense corruption in here. There's so much nepotism. There are so many managers taking just basically ripping the government off this way, that way. There's no oversight. It's like a zoo of criminality. He said, I'm the only honest manager I know. And he did get private dinner with LBJ. My mom and dad got to go up to D.C., have a private dinner with LBJ. You know, for his work, for his dedicated work for decades in this country. But I would say, looking back, is you know, there's no measurement, no assessment going on, no evaluation, real time. I mean, it's kind of like so many things going on. I could make the example of the nuclear industry. Now I'm hearing from nuclear experts, we have more rods in our reactors here than they had over in Fukushima, and these you know, reactors that blew. We've got a ticking time bomb here. I mean, the basics of engineering is, where do you take out the garbage? What do you do with the garbage? Every stage like this is these different things. We've got so much garbage turning up, and actually you start to see a pattern. Is the government bureaucracies profit off of failure. They profit off of not doing their job. I started to tune in on this during when I was working in the corporate world. I'd have my division I was working in, and you know, once in a while I'd get maybe assigned an assistant. There were people who had departments who started after me. They pretty soon they got 12 people working for them. Well, why was I over here not getting resources? Why were they getting all these resources thrown at them? Because they were not doing their jobs. Because they continually failed, the failure was rewarded. So we have a major dysfunctional problem here in society. There's very little honesty, there's a lot of criminality, and there's a lot of just being asleep at the wheel of the public. Thank you.
Who's next? Have we got a next? John? No? Am I the last man standing? Oh, you really? All right, give me next.
All right, because of my work being a reporter, learning, trying to become a reporter, and that I was able to do things nice and easy and get people to talk, I had a privilege to go down to Tyler, Texas with a religious group, the kind of like 700 Club. And what I heard down there floored me. They were interviewing a man, actually making a movie of him. And what happened was he was convicted of child abuse. And the story goes on is 10 years later, after the man is in prison, the daughter says, why is daddy in prison? And mother sits the child down, delicately as possible, explains what happened, or at least what was said in court. And he said, daddy never did that. No one told me to say those things. He's still in prison. And I got the chance to talk to him because everybody thought I was with the religious group. And unfortunately, the story died. It didn't get printed. But it's still there. It still happens today. The system is broke. Because they say the child is now lying when it was originally telling the truth. And that is their philosophy. As part of the psychological philosophy, you know, this religion, as best I can call it, of sex offenders, of nothing ever goes wrong. We're always right. Thank you.
You want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Are you timing yourself?
I'm timing myself because I'll go way too far over. Education is key here, right? Especially for the sex offender situation. If you only want to teach abstinence to kids who are learning about their own sexuality by experimenting, it's crazy. It's absolutely insane. We have to teach some modicum of health in the public school system. Okay? I went to private schools. They gave us the sex ed class in private Catholic school. It was not a problem. But we veer away from science, I guess. Or we fear giving people information that may actually help them. John, I agree with you that there are some situations where there's just corruption. But I will say one thing, and I've talked to a lot of different people who are running for elected office, who are currently judges, who are running for re-election. And what I will say is the difference between the Democratic judges of Dallas County versus the Republican judges who formerly controlled Dallas County is the fact that they have created so many divert courts to actually assess the individuals and determine, did this person commit a crime because they are heinous and evil and doing things that absolutely they should be put away to prison for a long, long time? Or what were the circumstances that led to this crime? So you end up with people like Judge Peggy Hoffman, who've created a program called PRIDE, Pride, and I don't know exactly what it stands for, but it's for women who get into the sex trade. Yes, thank you. And to help them stop that cycle, to break that cycle, to figure out why they're in that to begin with, and try to help resolve that. There are people like Elizabeth Crowder, who's spoken here at College of Complexes, Judge Elizabeth Crowder, who, is someone needing counseling or needing to get into alcoholism treatment to stop that cycle of DWI, DUI, whatever's happening. Those are just a couple of people. But there are so many stories of before these, and I'll call them good judges, got into the courts, of people who were indigent being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars that the judges knew they could never, ever pay. I think we've got to take a look at who we're electing and why, because judges are elected in the state of Texas. Many states, they're not elected. I think this is probably about to go off. I just want to honor you guys for being able to stand up, speak your truth, to continue doing what you do. I know it's probably gut-wrenching to have to live through that again and again, but I'm hoping that it's cathartic as well. And I'm going to say one thing. There were so many people who were receiving counseling and saying, oh, I was abducted in a mall, because the therapist was putting into that child's brain that they had been taken in a mall before malls even existed. So we've got to stop and think. I do believe that there are very good counselors out there who do try to help people, but there are also people who are just looking to try to perpetuate their own income. And we've got to separate the wheat from the chaff there and make sure that that all people are respected, that all people's value can be maximized. I don't know how that happens. I'm looking for good ideas from others. I've got 30 seconds left, and I will cede that to the next person. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to be next? Well,
Then you, we won't be out here.
I want to echo what Susie had to say. I want to thank you guys for coming. It must be very difficult to do this, and your mission is extremely challenging to try to educate people. But I think the metastasis actually is fear. That's the truth, and it's the fear of the other. And what really is happening here is that fear creates an economic demand. Okay, politicians can go out and they can't wait to blame the other person, their rival. They can't wait to say he supports sex offenders. He supports criminals. He voted to let criminals out into society to threaten you. What is the public going to do? They're going to vote for him. They're going to vote for any legislation that he proposes when he gets into power. Okay, and that legislation is going to be extreme. That's what you're affected by. That's what the other demand that satisfies are these companies, these private companies. They're not socialists. They are private. This is capitalism. Make no mistake. They're out there sucking on the government, and they're exploiting that fear to house and to keep their institutions almost 100% full. That's really the issue, and that's happened. This fear of the other has happened throughout our history, as you said. I mean, especially after Jim Crow. I mean, it's happened. I mean, we've done it with black people. We've done it with immigrants before that. We've done it with the natives before that. I mean, that is, and I'm Irish too. Not that I've experienced that, but anyway, that's all I have to say.
Did you want to say something, John?
I can say.
Make it quick.
We're going to be charging.
Yeah, I think the collected assembly here must realize the fact that this really basically is a punitive society. And I think it comes from religion, really. You know, I think the Protestant religion really is a punitive religion. And unless you can introduce the notion of having real moral value, having real Christianity, which actually, in England, you had to go and receive scripture lessons 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, we were all Church of England, so we had to go. So, but my reading of it was, kindness and helping people. And we have a society that the corporations, the minute there's a downturn, they throw people on the scrap heap, and if you're over 50, you'll stay there. And that really goes from, top to bottom. Now, what it's going to take, really, I think, is a moral revolution, I think, to say, look, what kind of society are we, and what kind of society do we want to be? And I think John's right. I mean, a lot of this is based on fear. Fear of this, fear of that. I mean, I thought we were all supposed to be rugged Americans. Let's get off our knees and stand up and say, look, this is a good society we want to be, and these are the steps we need to take to get there.
No, we're out of time. We're out of time. You had your chance. You had your chance. You had Susie's 30 seconds. I'm the last man standing, so I'll have to. Anyway, I want to thank our speakers for being here tonight. I think they did a terrific job. They opened our minds to what we can do, what we can't do, and that itself is an accomplishment that otherwise wouldn't have happened. I'm reminded, I think it's the state of Washington, half the people are in prison, the other half are working to keep people in prison. I've read that somewhere. And that compares to Texas somewhat. I'm astounded at what you brought up about the people producing all the work in prison that is being done and the private enterprise is making money on. It's not a good thing. I'm from Illinois, not that it matters. I think the only thing they make there is license plates, and that's it. They keep it minimized. I think that having slave labor is what it amounts to, and using prison labor to have private enterprise is the worst thing we can do, and that should be downtrodden quite a bit. Anyway, I've said all I'm going to say. I cut him off anyway, but you get the last word, so you get to comment on the comment and close this meeting. Both of you.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the thoughts of oversight. This last legislative session, State Representative Alma Allen put in a bill 877 that called for a committee, an oversight committee, to watchdog TDCJ. And my wife and I went to the Senate hearings and testified in support of that bill. But naturally, it died in committee. But we've already begun the work of trying to encourage legislators to vote for it in 2015. And we're really going to try to push it through. Oversight is the key to ending a lot of this corruption and inhumane practices. The ACA, American Correctional Association, is supposed to be sort of a watchdog over TDCJ. The taxpayers pay millions of dollars every year to have their prison units accredited by the ACA. That accreditation is supposed to protect TDC from litigation by prisoners. They have a whole big volume of standards, and they tell the prison officials, if you abide by these standards, you won't have to worry about losing a lawsuit. And a very interesting fact was disclosed a few months ago. Our national leader of National Cure, Charlie Sullivan, he went to the ACA Standards Committee's public forum where you're supposed to be able to get up and make proposals for new standards and all this. Well, as you probably know, TDCJ is being sued right now on 4 wrongful death suits of 4 inmates, or rather their surviving family members, who died from heat-related causes. So Charlie was going to give a talk about asking the ACA to make a standard that all prisons that it certifies have climate control and keep the temperature below a certain level. Well, right before he was to take the podium, the director of that committee, the chairman of the standards committee, came out in the lobby and told him, Mr. Sullivan, we're not going to allow you to give your talk. And Charlie was flabbergasted, and he was turned away. He couldn't speak. Take a guess who the chairman of that standards committee is. Brad Livingston, the director of Texas Department of Corrections.
And in closing, I appreciate everyone for coming out tonight, listening to us. I encourage you to educate your friends and legislators and ask them where they are in this position and tell them where you are. Thank you.
Okay, for what it's worth, we're all retiring to Starbucks down the street. I have my phone. And anyway, you're all welcome down there, and our speakers are welcome down there. And we'll continue the conversation. They want us out here by 9 o'clock, just so you know. Thank you again.
This is William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below or